Hello, I'm Peter Smith, and this webinar is brought to you by Spend Matters and Wax Digital. So, I've been working in procurement now for 30 years or so. I started out as a purchasing manager. I worked as a procurement director in 3 organizations, and then moved into a range of consulting roles. I'd always enjoyed writing, and I co-wrote a book and got into blogging to support my consulting business. And then about 6 years ago, I teamed up with Jason Bush, who had founded Spend Matters in the States, and we started Spend Matters UK Europe. And we're a website, and we write about all aspects of procurement, quite an emphasis on technology, but many other things as well. I guess when I look back at my career, one thing that's interesting and maybe a bit unusual is that I've worked in everything from pretty much a one-man band business, that being myself, through small firms, a small consulting firm. I worked for a food company that had made lots of small acquisitions and grown into sort of mid-sized business. I've also worked for huge global firms, a large government department, and across lots of different sectors. So I've seen organizations at different stages of maturity and size and how they handle procurement. And I've seen some of the growing pains that organizations get as they develop procurement. And in terms of this presentation, Foundations for Best Practice Procurement, I really want to talk about that cycle and how organizations develop those foundations and get to the point of best practice procurement, wherever they start from. So we'll get into all of that in a minute or two. Let me just say a little bit about Wax Digital. The firm is one of the leading cloud procurement software providers, and they deliver source-to-pay solutions to mid and large organizations all around the world. Their software is genuinely intuitive and easy to use. Their accessible software platform is called Web3, and it delivers spend control across the purchasing life cycle for over 260,000 users now in 100+ countries, and tens of millions of transactions annually. Here are some of the customers of Wax Digital, and in terms of the product portfolio, you can see it's a broad technology suite covering everything across the source-to-pay cycle. It's a fully integrated package. It was designed and built by the firm from the ground up on a single code base, and everything from spend analysis, savings forecasting, sourcing, contract and supplier management, and purchase to pay. Now, as you may well know, there's quite a lot of vendors today with what seem like quite similar propositions. So just briefly, 3 things that we think make Wax Digital a bit different in the market. First of all, it is a cohesive suite built on that single platform and strong in both downstream and upstream procurement capabilities. So some other providers have made acquisitions and their platform is not as cohesive, let's say. Wax also put a lot of thought into issues of integration with other software, other products. And finally, the firm's always been one of the innovators in the market. I think they picked up on the need to bring B2C, so consumer type thinking, into B2B long before most companies actually. And more recently, they've experimented with things like Google Glasses. That may or may not be a long-term success. But I think the people at Wax are always trying to look ahead and think of the next thing for procurement. So back to our core topic. And let me take you through a typical life cycle of a small organization. So in the beginning, procurement is pretty simple. There's probably a business owner, and he or she buys some things, and the recording of that is probably a spreadsheet, maybe even still paper records provided to their accountant, or maybe a package like Sage. But the transactions and the whole business of procurement is frankly relatively straightforward. As we move on a bit, most firms and other organizations, including public sector, will probably get a finance professional into the business before a procurement professional. So finance starts playing a role, but it may still be the business owner, the boss, who's placing most of the contracts, who's dealing with the suppliers. But other staff get involved. They may go through the business owner to ask for permission. They may go through finance. So you can see the relationships are still getting somewhat more complex, although most buying, the more significant transactions certainly, will probably still go through the boss in this case. Then as the organization gets bigger, we start getting real complexity. So other staff start dealing with suppliers directly. There may not be a single owner anymore. This may be the board we're talking about. Finance generally start getting a bit worried about what's going on. How can they control this? How do they know who's spending what? Budgets are now put in place. There's monitoring against budgets. And some sort of finance system probably becomes essential. But finance are probably still thinking of that in terms of control rather than any sort of added value from the procurement element of it. And then at some point, procurement arrives. Different levels for different sorts of organizations. In the private sector, I've typically seen organizations getting maybe to 5 million revenue, which probably means they're spending 2 to 3 million with external suppliers. And at that point, they look at it and they say, well, you know, if we got a procurement manager, if they could save 5% on that 2 to 3 million a year, that would be £100,000, dollars, euros, whatever, maybe a bit more. Well, that would comfortably pay for their salary and a bit more. So we'll invest in a procurement person. And that's fine. That's good news. But of course, if the procurement person is sitting there with no more assistance, without any real systems or technology to help, it can be a very frustrating and difficult role. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So as the organization develops and grows, it inevitably gets more complex. And complexity is driven by a number of different factors. So just growth and size in itself makes business get more complex. As more staff come in, that's another dimension of complexity. Inevitably, there'll be more suppliers. And what we see in larger organizations is we start having not just procurement and the budget holders, but we have experts as well. So if you want to buy some IT, you have to get the approval or the input of the IT manager before you go to procurement, perhaps. We then see organizations making acquisitions, and this is a huge source of complexity. I mean, I've heard presentations from larger firms where they talk about having literally hundreds of different ERP and indeed procurement systems. And that's often companies that have grown by acquisition. So they acquire these different systems through the different companies. And geographic expansion, of course. So all of this makes life more complicated. And at every stage of the growth, organizations need different skills, different suppliers, of course, and appropriate processes and systems are essential. And procurement has to grow and adapt. And suppliers have to grow and adapt. I would appoint a supplier who put a new roof on my house, and they did a superb job. Would I appoint them to rebuild Waterloo Station in London, which is the lower picture? Probably not. So we need to change and adapt as we get bigger. And now we really get to the heart of this discussion. So what are the problems organizations face as they grow? And then, of course, we'll come on to some of the things they can do to overcome those problems. So trying to put it very, very basically and look at these foundations. Problem number one, we don't know what we're spending. We don't know who spends it, on what, and with which suppliers. And you can see straight away that's a pretty fundamental issue. We don't control that spend properly, which means we don't forecast and plan it, and then we may not even know exactly what's happened after the event. So those two are very much linked. Then we've got the issue of value. So even if we know a bit about where it's going, how do we know whether we're really getting value for that expenditure? And of course, as the organization grows, that gets more and more critical. The numbers get bigger. And the point really about my builder. We don't know if we have the right suppliers for today and tomorrow. Suppliers have a fundamental role in virtually every organization. They help organizations develop competitive advantage. They contribute towards the fundamental mission of the organization, perhaps if it's in the public sector, in the government sector. So So suppliers have to contribute, and we've got to get the right suppliers to help us with that today and tomorrow. As I say, the right supplier tomorrow will be different from the right supplier today. So they're problems I think most of us will understand and may have come across, and of course they lead to some negative outcomes. If we don't know where the money's going or going to go, how can we plan financially? Certainly can't do commitment accounting, for instance. Are we wasting money? Pretty basic question. And perhaps, do we have fraud and corruption? And I can honestly say every organisation I've worked in for any length of time, we've found some fraud or corruption in the procurement and supply chain space. And if you don't think it's happening in your organisation, I'd suggest you just, well, frankly, either you're naive or you haven't looked hard enough. And if you don't have controls and good systems and good data, then it's more likely. High levels of risk in the supply chain. Again, if you don't understand your spend, there may be all sorts of risks that you're not aware of and therefore haven't mitigated in your supply base. Wasted time and inefficient processes. People spending hours, days, chasing invoices, trying to work out who bought what, trying to find out what happened to that contract we placed last year. And all of these things place constraints on growth and innovation. And here's a few genuine quotes I remember from my time in various organizations. This is the sort of thing, procurement, and maybe we go back to that situation where there's the first one or two procurement managers in an organization, or it may be a much bigger company for that matter. But procurement hears things like this. Well, I didn't know I was supposed to get 3 bids. Nobody told me. Or somebody will say, well, I don't know why we're still using that supplier. They're useless. Or it's no good telling me I've overspent my budget. You should have told me that before I closed that deal, before I made that purchase. And then the classic, I heard this, I was speaking at a conference yesterday, and I heard this from a procurement director, in fact more than this. He was told, literally, if his organisation did not make a £1 million purchase today, they would lose the money for that, because the money had come from a grant or a charitable donation or something, and it was time-bound, and the organisation hadn't got round to telling procurement particularly quickly. So it was, we have to place an order for this £1 million item today. So, but the typical thing I remember from various of my roles is, we've got a new product launch in 3 weeks, we've got to have a supplier who can do this, or the whole launch fails. So these are the frustrating comments we can hear. And what we hear from procurement, the procurement manager or department. So I remember having this in the past. The board want to know who our top 10 suppliers are, and I don't have a clue. We just don't have the data. Or we're chasing round after low-value orders while some of our stakeholders are spending huge amounts of money and we're not involved. Or what about this? I know we've got far too many suppliers in this area, but I just don't have time to sort it out. Or the CEO's meeting a few other top people and she wants a detailed briefing on these 3 firms and I just haven't got the information. So let's just look at those issues and the consequences in a bit more detail before we move on to some of the solutions. We don't know what we're spending, who we're spending it with, which suppliers. The consequences, I guess, are fairly clear here. Poor value purchases, inefficient processes, lots of different processes probably, difficult to handle invoices in any sort of efficient manner, and that fraud and corruption issue I touched on. So that can be anything from just favoured suppliers, maybe that's favoured suppliers who take the budget holder out for a nice lunch occasionally. Not too much harm in that perhaps, but that goes all the way through to fake invoices. And there's been some cases recently where companies have lost millions, where they've paid an invoice to what they thought was a genuine supplier for genuine work, and it was a fake bank account created to siphon off those funds. And if you don't have good systems, or you don't know what you're spending with whom, that can happen. Poor budget management we touched on. This lack of visibility for senior management, being able to answer those basic questions from the board about where their money's going. And if you don't have any data, it's difficult to put in place even basic procurement policies, rules, and processes. If we aren't controlling, forecasting, and planning our spending, we get some of these things happening. Poor resource allocation, not knowing where to best spend our money. Again, fraud and corruption. We can't take advantage of economies of scale. If we don't know where perhaps different parts of our business are spending money on the same items, how can we apply aggregation, leverage, economies of scale? We may be exposed to market risks that we don't understand, and again, we can't put in place those very basic processes. Now moving on to value. Well, that's pretty fundamental, isn't it? I guess in the private sector, if we don't know whether we're getting value for money from our spend, we're certainly not maximising shareholder value. And money that could have been better used elsewhere is being wasted or used inefficiently at best. We may be selecting the wrong suppliers, and we may have poor supplier performance once they're in place. If we don't monitor what we're getting, if we don't have contract management in place, how do we know whether we're getting value from those suppliers? And ultimately, as I say, there's an issue around bottom line shareholder value. Now moving on to the more forward-looking aspect, do we have the right suppliers for today and tomorrow? So are we capturing innovation from our supply base and supply chain? A lot of companies have now realized that most of the innovation in terms of new products, new ideas, new processes is more likely to come from suppliers than internally, just because there's far more resource there. You know, one company, however good, and I can think of some huge consumer goods companies that now think very much in this way, and pharmaceuticals, they've realized they can't do as much internally as they can get from their entire supply base in terms of that innovation and development. Supply chain risk we've talked about before, including reputational risk. Are your suppliers employing 6-year-old children in the developing world, for instance? And ultimately, this can all come back to competitive advantage. So, okay, having painted this picture of not exactly doom and gloom, but the problems and the consequences, what can we do about it? Well, we'd suggest there's obviously a whole host of steps you can take, but 4 sort of foundational steps, all linked to technology, which I think is inevitable these days. 4 things that you can and should be looking at if you haven't done so already. So first of all, putting core procurement processes in place. I'm talking about the real basics of buying. Who's allowed to place orders? What process do they have to go through before they can commit to a supplier? What is the requisitioning and ordering process? What's the documentation around that? What's the approvals for it? How do you link that to invoicing? On what basis do we pay invoices? All of those things that fit into a purchase-to-pay cycle and a purchase-to-pay system. And it's critical that you explain clearly to your users how they have to work, how people will buy, the roles of the different participants. I've seen too many procurement policies or process maps, operating models that just didn't make it clear. What's the role of the budget holder? What's the role of the approver? What's the role of procurement? So really spell that out. And that can be developed over time and made more sophisticated, improving the user experience with catalogs, for instance, making efficiencies with e-invoicing, and supporting more added value activities. But again, it comes back to getting those basics in place first of all. Secondly, spend analysis. Very simply, that's the process of looking at what you've spent and being able to analyze it in terms of suppliers, spend categories, geography, cost centers, all of those aspects. And once you start doing this and getting a grip on where the money's going, you can link that back into the budget planning and reporting and work with finance to put proper reporting and controls in place. And you can also use that analysis to start identifying value opportunities. At a simple level, that might be things like aggregation, finding out that 10 different departments are buying the same thing separately. Let's pull that together and get a better deal. Compliance, are people using the contracts that you've put in place? And indeed, supplier compliance. Are they charging the prices that they said they would charge? And spend analysis can go into many much more sophisticated areas today that we'll save for another presentation. But this is, again, a starting point. Introduce a planned and structured sourcing program. So this is the business of actually going out to the market, finding the right suppliers, putting in place the right deals. Category management, another whole topic in itself, is generally the way companies structure this now. If you have enough procurement resource, probably not relevant if you really are starting up with a small procurement team, but that's just about putting similar items together and taking a strategic approach to how you source them, how you buy them. So you can use spend analysis to prioritize the areas you're going to address. Obviously look for the areas with high spend, lots of suppliers, competitive markets, because you're more likely to make quick wins there. And e-sourcing tools will certainly increase productivity. They also give much better sense of what's gone on, an audit trail to the process, and you can start looking at things like reverse auctions and other clever techniques to drive out further value. And the last of our four, a systemized contract database. So this is about capturing not the spend detail, but the actual detail of the contracts. What do the contracts say? What have suppliers committed to? What are they going to deliver? How are you going to monitor that? Now, if you are in a sort of startup procurement situation, you won't get a contract database overnight covering every contract that's in place in your organization. But you can start with the most important contracts, the biggest, the most mission critical, if you like. And you can then identify the most strategic suppliers and start looking at what we tend to call SRM, supplier relationship management, how you get additional value from your key strategic suppliers. Don't be too ambitious, though. If you haven't got solid contract management in place, I'd always recommend that you start with that, because you really need that to build your strategic relationship management on top of. We touched on software when I gave the Wax Digital introduction. There are different components to this. We've talked about spend analytics, sourcing, contract management, ordering, payment, and supplier management really runs across all of those when you think about it, from the initial engagement with the supplier and what we call onboarding, getting their details, all the way through to managing the relationship and the contract. And generally in the procurement technology world, we tended to see two different types of software. We had companies offering source to contract, so that was actually the sourcing, running the tendering processes and so on, and then probably through to contract management. And then we had purchase to pay providers handling the transactional side of it, ordering through to payment, basically. Now, what we're increasingly seeing with companies like Wax Digital and others is the offer to have a single integrated source to pay technology platform, really handling all those areas. And again, there's another whole presentation about the advantages of that approach and what you can get out of having that integration. But there's some of the terms you'll hear, and if you're starting to talk to technology firms, you'll hear them defining themselves in this way. But to note, this presentation hasn't intended to be purely about technology, and I hope it didn't come across like that. It is key today. And frankly, back when I was a procurement director, you could probably still be seen pretty much as a best practice procurement organization and not have an awful lot of technology in place. That's just not the case now. I mean, you cannot get anywhere close to good practice procurement, I'd argue, without having some decent technology. But it's not enough. I'm a mathematician by training, so we'd say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. You need people. You need good people with the right skills and approach. That's probably within the procurement function and in your key stakeholder base as well. And you need that clear policy and governance framework. That's the thing that I mentioned earlier that really explains people's roles and what they have to do. And this all requires support from top management as well. So one of the key roles of procurement leaders these days, and that's whether you're a procurement leader in the sense of being a one-person procurement function or whether you're leading a team of 500. A key role is to get top management on board, make sure they're understanding what you're doing, sell the benefits to them, and point out the risks of doing nothing. We have to make a strong case for procurement investment and resource, and that's down really to that procurement leadership. Okay, that's about all from me. Wax Digital have got on their website a rather nice feature which they call the Diary of an Overworked Procurement Manager, which I very much enjoyed reading, and that is written in a diary sort of case study fashion and covers some of these issues that we've talked about, particularly in terms of an organisation that maybe doesn't have a lot of procurement resource and is growing rapidly, and there's lots of exciting opportunities, but maybe some of those issues as well. So if you get a chance, do have a look on the Wax Digital website and look for that secret diary of a procurement manager. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Thank you on behalf of Wax Digital and Spend Matters. Do have a look at our Spend Matters websites. And if you'd like more information on anything I've talked about, please don't hesitate to get in touch. There's some Wax Digital details there. Drop them a line, send an email, make a phone call, whatever. And I hope you found this useful. Many thanks and good luck with your procurement development.